pressure of constantly looking for funds to maintain the level of work that they need to do, and to give them that encouragement in building relationships. Not always easy relationships, I have to say.
She wore them for 70 years. She was buried with a legacy that lives on in bluestone and diamond. And now, more than 3 years after her death, the question of who gets to wear Queen Elizabeth II's sapphires has quietly become one of the most fascinating threads in the modern story of the House of Windsor. This isn't a tale of a single dramatic showdown behind palace doors. It's something more interesting than that. A decades-long story of a father's love, a queen's personal taste, and an unwritten set of rules about who gets to carry a monarchy's memory on their body, rules that are being tested right now, in real time, every time Queen Camilla steps out for a state banquet. To understand why a set of sapphires can matter this much to an institution built on continuity and symbolism, you have to go back to 1947, to a wedding, and to a father who wanted to give his daughter something that would outlast him. In November 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. She was 21 years old, not yet queen, still finding her footing as the heir who would one day carry an empire's worth of expectation. Her father, King George VI, gave her a wedding present that was almost startling in its simplicity and its weight, a necklace and a pair of earrings, both set with large sapphires bordered in diamonds. The stones themselves were not new. Jewelry historians date the pieces to around 1850, meaning George VI had sought out gems with nearly a century of history already behind them by the time he placed them in his daughter's hands. Accounts from the era describe the sapphires as extraordinary in size. The playwright Noel Coward is remembered as remarking that he had never seen sapphires so large. This was not an impulsive gift. It was curated, deliberate, and clearly meant to mark a threshold moment, a young woman stepping into a marriage and, though no one could have known exactly when, eventually into a throne. The set later expanded. A bracelet and a ring joined the original necklace and earrings, and at some point the necklace itself was subtly redesigned. Collectively, jewelry historians now refer to this as the George VI Sapphire Parure, sometimes called the George VI Victorian Suite, a nod to the Victorian-era origins of the stones themselves. For Elizabeth, this wasn't simply an accessory to be worn and forgotten. It was one of the last significant personal gifts she would receive from her father, who died just over 4 years later, in February 1952, thrusting his 25-year-old daughter onto the throne far sooner than anyone had expected. Every time she wore the sapphires afterward, she was, in a sense, wearing a piece of him. Most of what a monarch wears is inherited, passed down through generations, arriving with its own long history already attached. But Elizabeth did something less common with her sapphires. She went looking for more. In 1963, roughly a decade into her reign, the Queen acquired a 19th-century necklace that had originally belonged to Princess Louise of Belgium. Louise's life had ended in scandal and financial ruin, and pieces from her collection had been dispersed and sold over the decades. The necklace found its way to Van Cleef Arpels, and it was there that Elizabeth purchased it, not as a gift, not as an inheritance, but as a considered acquisition to complete a set she already loved. She had the necklace reworked by the royal jewelers Gerard into a tiara, one designed specifically to be worn alongside her father's sapphire parure. That tiara, now known as the Belgian sapphire tiara, sometimes called the Victorian sapphire tiara or the George VI tiara, made its public debut during the Queen's state visit to Germany in 1965. It went on to have a long and varied life in her rotation. It appeared during a Caribbean tour in 1966, and a state visit from Japan in 1971, was worn steadily through the 1980s, then found a particular resurgence of popularity in the 1990s, turning up at state banquets, a return dinner at Claridge's, a visit to Pakistan in 1997, and state visits to both the United States and Russia. Even in her later years, as she gravitated toward lighter tiaras for comfort, the Belgian sapphire made appearances at state visits from Colombia and China. Its final public outing came in one of the most quietly significant images of her reign, her official portrait as Queen of Canada, photographed at Windsor Castle in 2019 and released by the Canadian government the following year. By the time of her Sapphire Jubilee in 2017, marking 65 years on the throne, Elizabeth chose to be photographed wearing the complete suite, the tiara her own initiative had created, and the necklace and earrings her father had given her 70 years earlier. It was, in its own quiet way, a portrait of her entire life arranged in a single frame: inheritance and independence, father and reign, side by side. Here's something that surprises even dedicated royal watchers. The jewelry the public saw Elizabeth II wear across 7 decades of photographs, portraits, and state occasions was only a fraction of what she actually owned. By the time of her death, Elizabeth's personal jewelry collection, distinct entirely from the crown jewels, which are state property used only for coronations and the state opening of Parliament, numbered more than 300 individual pieces. That included 98 brooches, 46 necklaces, 37 bracelets, 34 pairs of earrings, 20 tiaras, 15 rings, 14 watches, and 5 pendants. Most of this collection was assembled the way royal collections typically are, through inheritance from earlier generations, as wedding and birthday gifts from foreign heads of state and members of the aristocracy, and through a handful of personal purchases like the Belgian sapphire necklace. Because it is personal property rather than state regalia, this collection is not bound by the same rules that govern the crown jewels. It can, in principle, be inherited, gifted, lent, or redistributed among family members according to the Queen's own wishes that were set out in a will the public will likely never see. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, at least by the standards of how inheritance normally works in Britain. For most people, once a will goes through probate, it becomes a public document anyone can request and read it. Royal wills don't work that way. Since 1910, following the death of Prince Francis of Teck, whose will reportedly contained embarrassing details, including a bequest of valuable emeralds to his mistress, it has become tradition for the wills of senior royals to be sealed from public view entirely, indefinitely, at the request of their executors. That changed slightly in 2021. When the courts considered the will of Prince Philip, the Queen's own lawyers actually argued for it to remain sealed for a remarkable 125 years. The presiding judge, Sir Andrew McFarlane, ruled that 90 years was proportionate and sufficient, instead establishing for the first time in over a century a process by which royal wills might eventually become public. After 90 years, each sealed will is to be examined privately by the monarch's solicitors, the Attorney General, and any surviving representatives of the deceased, who then decide together whether any part of it should be released. Some, McFarlane noted, may never be published at all. Queen Elizabeth II's own will falls under this same convention. It is sealed, its contents known only to a small circle of solicitors and family, and by the current rules it will not even be reviewed for potential release until sometime near the year 2112. Whatever she specifically decided about the distribution of 300-plus pieces of jewelry, who gets the sapphires, who gets the pearls she was rarely seen without, who gets the more obscure pieces that spent decades sitting quietly in a vault at Balmoral or Sandringham, is simply not public information, and by design, may never be. What we know instead comes from something far more visible than any legal document: who wears what, and when. Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral on September 8, 2022. Within months, a clear pattern had emerged in how pieces of her jewelry collection were being redistributed among the women of the family, and the Belgian sapphire tiara, along with the necklace from the George VI parure, became closely associated with one person in particular, Camilla, now Queen. Camilla wore the Belgian sapphire tiara for the first time in public at the South African State Banquet in November 2022, pairing it with a necklace from the George VI sapphire parure. She wore the same combination again at the diplomatic reception at Buckingham Palace that December. Royal jewelry historians who track these appearances closely have noted that since Elizabeth's death, Camilla has become the only royal seen wearing the Belgian sapphire tiara at all, and that it has quickly become one of her most frequently worn pieces from the late Queen's collection. There is nothing unusual in isolation about a queen consort inheriting jewelry from her predecessor. This is, in fact, exactly how royal collections have always grown and moved through generations. Queen Elizabeth herself inherited jewelry from Queen Mary and the Queen Mother before her. What makes Camilla's position slightly more complicated is the informal, unofficial nature of how it happened. There was no announcement, no formal accounting of which specific pieces moved to which family member, simply a series of public appearances that, pieced together over the following months, revealed the outlines of a much larger redistribution happening quietly within royal households. Camilla has also been seen wearing other pieces once closely associated with Elizabeth, including a diamond and aquamarine tiara that made a notable appearance at a 2025 diplomatic reception. The public was shown over time only pieces of the picture, a tiara here, a necklace there, glimpsed at state banquets and official portraits. Given that the late Queen's full collection ran past 300 items, and that the will governing its distribution is sealed for the better part of a century, there is an enormous amount of jewelry that has simply never been seen or accounted for publicly at all. This is the more accurate meaning behind any talk of a hidden sapphire collection, not a conspiracy, not stolen goods spirited out of a vault, but the ordinary, undramatic reality that most of what a monarch owns in jewelry never appears in a single photograph across an entire reign. Pieces are worn privately, lent informally between family members, or simply kept in storage at residences that receive far less public attention than Buckingham Palace, places like Sandringham and Balmoral, where much of the collection has historically been kept. Because there has been no official inventory released since Elizabeth's death, and because the will itself remains locked away, the full and honest answer to who has what is that, outside a very small circle of family and legal advisors, nobody actually knows. What the public can observe is only ever a proxy who wears which piece, and how often. If anyone in the family has a personal, almost proprietary relationship with her mother's legacy, it is Princess Anne, the late Queen's only daughter, and by most accounts the most work-focused and least ceremonial member of the family. Anne was the last of Elizabeth's 4 children to be with her before she died, a fact she spoke about publicly in the days after her mother's passing, describing it in a statement as an honor and a privilege to have accompanied her mother on her final journey. That closeness has continued to shape how Anne carries herself in the years since. She has frequently been photographed wearing pieces that once belonged to her mother: brooches, pearls, small personal items not as fashion statements but, by most accounts from those who follow royal style closely, as a quiet, ongoing tribute. One particular example: not long after the Queen's death, Anne wore a sapphire and pearl brooch that had once belonged to Empress Maria Feodorovna of Russia, at a dinner she hosted at the British High Commissioner's residence in Uganda. The brooch, decorated with emeralds, sapphires, and rubies, had been part of the royal collection for roughly 6 decades by that point. Anne herself had first been photographed wearing it as an 11-year-old at a royal Maundy service back in 1962. That's the kind of relationship Anne has with these objects. They aren't simply beautiful things passed down the family tree. They are markers of a life she watched up close for over 70 years. In an interview reflecting on her mother's approach to style, Anne once described the difference her mother drew between fashion and style, noting that her mother didn't concern herself with fashion, but that she absolutely had style, and that style, unlike fashion, tends to last. It's a small quote, but it captures something real about how the family, and Anne in particular, appear to think about these jewels not as trend pieces to be swapped in and out, but as something closer to a visual record of a life and a reign. The story of these jewels doesn't stop with Camilla. It's already reaching toward the generation after her. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has inherited a number of pieces from Elizabeth's collection in her own right, and has spoken in the past about eventually passing meaningful pieces down to her own daughter, Princess Charlotte, keeping them within the direct line of succession, the same way tiaras and necklaces have moved through the family for over a century. That's the traditional model. The institution has always relied on jewelry as a physical thread connecting one generation of working royals to the next, worn at the same kinds of state occasions, photographed in the same rooms, carrying forward the same associations,